Chapter 1. Early life. After being brought to Jamaica by way of the transatlantic slave trade, many enslaved Africans started fleeing from the oppressive conditions of the plantations the instant they saw an opportunity, eventually establishing their own communities in the rugged, hilly interior of the island. The escaped slaves eventually became known as Maroons. The term maroon derives from the Spanish word cimarron. This word was first used to describe runaway cattle before it became associated with escaped African slaves. The first known maroon is said to have been a slave who escaped from a galleon in 1502. His story of escaping to freedom created a continuous urge in other enslaved Africans to also run away from their captors. Those who did, now Maroons, joined together forming communities, generally found in remote areas protected by mountains, swamps, or jungles, some of which also operated as stations for raids on white settlements. Note, contrary to popular belief, Nanny did not start the Maroon movement, but was instead inspired by them. Maroons are descendants of African escaped slaves, who ran away from their Spanish-owned plantations, and existed even before the British captured the island of Jamaica from Spain in 1655. From as early as the 1650s, while under Spanish rule, enslaved Africans started escaping and intermarrying with the native islanders, the Taino or Arawak Indians. The first believed set of runaways formed communities in the Blue Mountains area of Jamaica, located in the parish of St. Thomas, on the eastern end of the island, giving them a perfect vantage point that almost guaranteed their security from their previous enslavers, and in the Cockpit Country region of the island, located on the western shores. Note, in 1662, while under Spanish rule, it is estimated that there was a total of just over 400 slaves on the island of Jamaica, but with the introduction of sugarcane, by 1673, now under English rule, that number ballooned to over 9,000, an over 2,000% increase. And as sugar became king, the plantation owners acquired more slaves to facilitate the workload, and in 1734, records show that there were 86,546 slaves on the island, a number that jumped to 192,787 by 1775. It must be noted that around this time, the cruelty handed down to slaves in Jamaica was considered by contemporaries to be amongst the most brutal in the world. In 1739, Charles Leslie, author of A New and Exact History of Jamaica, published in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1739, wrote, "No country excels Jamaica in the barbarous treatment of slaves or in the cruel methods they put them to death." With the English invasion of 1655, what many may not have known was that the fighting between the Spanish and English continued for approximately 5 years. Outgunned and outmanned, the Spanish got so desperate that it is said, they even made attempts to secure the help of the Maroons to reclaim the island, an effort which ultimately proved futile, due to tactics of manipulation by the English. Within a few years of their arrival on the island, the British governor, Edward de Willie, 1617 to 1675, an English soldier who served as governor of Jamaica on 2 occasions, managed to form an alliance with a Maroon, who many historians consider the first Maroon chief, known by the English as Juan de Bolas and to the Spanish as Juan Lúbalo, who along with his warriors, quickly eradicated the Spanish from their remaining settlements, towns, plantations, etc. It is believed that by around the late 1600s, the last remaining Spanish rulers exited the island, making their way to Cuba, unwillingly freeing their slaves in the process. For almost 3 years following the Spanish expulsion, Lúbalo served the British as a colonel, bringing other Maroon factions in alliance with them. But it wasn't all well with all the Maroon factions, because in short succession, Lúbalo was ambushed and killed by another Maroon leader, Juan de Serres, a move that initiated and led to over 7 decades of tension, skirmishes, and eventual war between the Maroons and the British. Spanish Maroon leaders, Juan de Bolas, circa 1604 to 1664, and Juan de Serres, also 2 of Jamaica's early Maroon chiefs, formerly enslaved Africans, were hell-bent on demolishing the reigns of Spanish control and liberating their brothers and sisters, and held the same view when it came to the English. They viewed them in the same light, and didn't take too kindly to Juan Lúbalo's position amongst and decision regarding them, the English, and eventually decided to deal with him like how they would have dealt with any other oppressor. a move that was root of what eventually became known as the First Maroon War, which started around 1728 and continued until the peace treaties of 1739 and 1740. Juan de Bolas and Juan de Serres weren't focused on negotiating with neither the Spanish nor English, but were more fixated on raiding plantations for weapons and food, burning the plantations, and leading freed slaves to join their mountain communities. Many say under these two was quite possibly one of the few times that the Maroons were truly united, a reality that quickly changed with the arrival of the English, who, it said, realizing the odds they were up against, skilled and experienced warriors who knew the terrain, made a move that would forever change the narrative of Maroon history. Under the directives of Admiral Sir William Penn and General Robert Venables, it is said that the English bribed de Bolas and his men to attack de Serres and his Maroon community, ending in carnage and bloodshed, only to be himself ambushed and killed about a year later by Maroons that were aligned to de Serres. Divide and conquer. The original intent of what these men, Juan de Bolas and Juan de Serres, were initially about, was the Maroon mentality that is said to have inspired Nanny, the spirit that ran through her veins, until she got involved and started to understand the politics and underhandedness that eventually became the Maroon reality, once the English were on the ground. According to Maroon legend, Nanny was born in the Akan region of West Africa, present-day Ghana, and Ivory Coast. There are several versions of her early life, but with it all being oral history, it is still unclear which is truly accurate. In one account it states that Nanny was born in the year 1686 in Ghana, Western Africa, into the Ashanti tribe, and was brought to Jamaica as a slave. It is believed that some of her family members were involved in a fiery intertribal conflict, which resulted in her village being raided and captured. It is believed that Nanny and several of her relatives were eventually sold as slaves and sent to Jamaica. Upon arrival, Nanny would have more than likely been sold to a plantation in the parish of St. Thomas, just outside of the Port Royal area. Such plantations grew sugarcane as the main crop, and the slaves were said to have toiled under extremely harsh conditions. It is believed that it was from this plantation that Nanny and her assumed brothers, Akampong, Cujo, Johnny, and Quayo, escaped from to the Blue Mountains area of northern St. Thomas after being influenced by the activities of the Maroons. Like their predecessors, upon escape they intermingled with the local inhabitants, Taino's Arawaks Indians, before eventually forming their own settlements. It must also be noted that upon their Nanny and her brothers' escape from the plantation, they could not just go and join a Maroon community, due to the risk of being captured by the very ones who had inspired them to make a run for the hills themselves, but had now been commissioned by the enslavers to capture any new runaways. Note, this was Jamaica under English control, not Spanish. The English made deals, signed treaties etc. with the Maroons to capture runaway slaves, not the Spanish. So it was not a runaway and come over here situation, it was run away and create your own settlement, which according to most accounts, was exactly what they did. From all indicators, if this account is correct, in what seemed like a bid to avoid capture, they eventually separated to organize more Maroon, runaway slaves, communities across the island. It must also be noted that according to Maroon history, Nanny became a community leader around 1720, with accounts placing her death at around 1733 and the early 1740s, although many Maroons insist that she died in the 1760s. Dispute of dates aside, what needs to be clear is that Nanny's exploits were against the British, not the Spanish. So one thing is for sure, she arrived in Jamaica after the British took over in 1655. Separation. Historical data shows that Cujo went to the parish of St. James, organizing a village which later became known as Cujo Town. Akampong settled in St. Elizabeth, in a community which became known as Akampong Town, while Nanny and Quayo founded communities in the parish of Portland, Nanny Town and Quayo Town or Village, later renamed Crawford's Town around 1746, when white superintendents appointed by the British governors took control and replaced Quayo as the Maroon leader of that community, appointing Edward Crawford, another Maroon officer, the new leader, after whom the town was eventually named. It is said that this development didn't go down well with Quayo and his supporters, who rose up in revolt but were soon cut down after Governor Sir Charles Knowles, 1st Baronet, a British naval officer, 1704 to December 9, 1777, sent a detachment under the command of a Lieutenant Ross to negotiate with Quayo, who outrightly rejected their proposal, With that development, Ross, it is said, secured the allegiance of the supporters of Crawford, who Quoa had killed in the uprising, as well as the support of other Windward Maroons, a contingent that quickly defeated Queo and his supporters, capturing and killing him, alongside a number of his Maroon officers. Another version of Nanny's early life claims that she was of royal African blood and came to Jamaica as a free woman, who may even had her own slaves. This account states that she eventually married to a Maroon named Adu, but had no known children who survived. In another account, it is said that Nanny came to Jamaica as a slave but escaped upon arrival, perhaps even jumping off the ship while it was offshore, even though there are countless Maroon oral traditions that maintain that she did arrive in Jamaica as a free woman. Although most of what is known about Nanny comes from oral history, as little written evidence exists, the general consensus by historians and contemporaries, regardless of the version one accepts regarding her origins, arrival on the island, and exploits, is that Nanny was an 18th century leader of the Jamaican Maroons, who led a community of formerly enslaved Africans called the Windward Maroons, and was known by both Maroons and British settlers as an outstanding military leader who became, in her lifetime and after, a symbol of hope, unity and strength for her people, during some of the darkest hours of Jamaica's infancy. Note, the Akan word for the ruler or one of his courtiers is Nana.